You're watching Hindustan Times, and I'm Aditi Prasad. I'm joined today by Julie Millsap from the Campaign for Uyghurs. Her organization has essentially demanded now from the United Nations that they recognize the systematic persecutions of millions of Muslim Uyghurs in China as genocide. Thank you, Julie, for joining us today. I just want to start off with the most important question. You know, your organization, the Campaign for Uyghurs, has come out with a report titled Genocide in East Turkestan. Now, the report lists instances where the Chinese government has persecuted Uyghurs. Can you take us through the key points, the key highlights of this report?
Yes, well, the purpose of our report is really to lay out as accessible information for anyone who looks at it that the atrocities that are being committed by the Chinese regime meet every condition of genocide as laid out by the United Nations. So really, it just begs the question of, are we waiting for the entire group of Uyghurs to be destroyed before the UN moves to declare this a genocide? So, for example, we can look at research that's come out, Dr. Adrian Zenza's report regarding the absolutely plummeting birth rate of Uyghurs. And this in itself is evidence of genocide, preventing births, separating children, forcing orphanages. The list goes on and on and on of all these building atrocities. And so with this all compiled in one report, anyone that looks at it should be able to understand the specifics of it, but also we will make some recommendations about how corporations, individuals, the UN, and different organizations should address the atrocities.
What are the key actions that you're demanding from the United Nations?
One of the main things that we think needs to be done very quickly is that China should be stripped of its position on the United Nations Human Rights Council panel. The fact that they sit on that panel is absolutely atrocious as one of the world's hugest violators of human rights. So that's the first action. We also would request that they demand immediate unfiltered access into the region so that inspections can be performed at will of the camps and of factories across China proper. In addition to that, we do think that there needs to be swift action to declare this a genocide.
You know, I was going through the report bit by bit, and you specifically talked about how there is a systematic plan to bring down the Muslim population in China by slashing the birth rates of Uyghurs. Can you take us through what exactly have your findings been?
Well, this is actually not really any new information. It's something that we've had eyewitness reports about for a long time, and it's also been confirmed through leaked Chinese government documents. But when you combine this information with what we see happen, rate internalizations, forced abortion, forced IUD insertion, and mandatory birth control, inmates reporting that they were given injections that stopped them menstruating, and people being thrown into the concentration camps for having more than one child, for example. When you combine the fact that we see videos being leaked out of Uyghur women who are being placed in forced marriages with Han Chinese settlers, and when we see the incentives being put forth by the government. In addition, when we know that under the double family program, that the Chinese government has arranged for Chinese Communist Party cadres to come in and move into homes with women, a lot of times their husbands are in the camps in prison, and they are vulnerable to sexual abuse in these situations. So really, when you combine all these factors together, it's very obvious what's going on, and it's quite frightening in this modern age of feminism and access to information that there isn't more outrage and outcry for the various ways that human rights are being violated, and in particular, how this affects women.
Given the complete blockage of the province and the reported information blackout that exists, how have they still managed to bring out these incidents to the world?
It's really been a process over the years. Back in 2014 is when the camps started to be built. And over the course of the past few years, China has changed the narrative, as you spoke about with the information blockade. They've also outright changed their narrative on what's happening multiple times. But with that, we've always been able to, at first, maybe we have witnesses coming out that are attesting to what's happening. And slowly we've had more and more people, including some foreign citizens, that were actually released from the camp and were able to give kind of the first major eyewitness accounts to what they witnessed in those camps. And in addition to that, in recent years, we've also had continuing leaking Chinese government documents. So if you look at the Caracox documents, for example, that was a really key thing in confirming in the very words of the Chinese government what was happening. And so we've continued to see that even in the leaked embassy documents that came out last week as well.
Right. When did this real crackdown start in this province? Is it in some manner related to the rise of Xi Jinping?
Well, what we've seen is while the oppression of Uyghurs in their homeland is a decades-long thing, since the post 9/11 world really began, we've seen that China has begun to really amp up its persecution of Uyghurs and the pressure on them. After the Urumqi massacre, of course, they had an excuse to crack down even heavier. And that whole entire situation was incredibly manipulated. And unfortunately, the foreign press, for the most part, bought right into the narrative that the Chinese government presented about that. And so things have really significantly worsened since 2009. With the rise of Xi Jinping, unfortunately, we have also seen that things continue to take this very authoritarian narrative where they didn't even feel the need so much to even justify, whereas before things might have been justified by painting Uyghurs as terrorists. Since he's come into power, we see a lot more of this feeling amongst Chinese government officials that they don't have to justify their actions, that they're fine with blatantly lying and changing their narrative to the international community. And they think that they won't face consequences for that. And unfortunately, we've seen that for the most part, they haven't faced consequences for that until we have it built up to this point where it's become a monster, to be quite frank. And so while I wouldn't necessarily say that everything is connected to Xi Jinping, we've certainly seen since he came into power that things have worsened significantly to this point where we're calling it a genocide.
Do you think that it's ironical that the OIC, which represents 57 Islamic countries, is ignoring the plight of fellow Uyghur Muslims?
Well, it is certainly disappointing. We know that they made a statement just saying that China was protecting the religious liberty of Muslims, which for anyone that's actually been in the country or familiar with the situation is quite preposterous. So it is very disappointing, but we do remember and just bring attention to the fact also that for a lot of people in these Arab countries, whether it's citizens or government leaders, they are also victims of China's massive disinformation campaign.
Given China's economic, military, and the geopolitical clout that that country enjoys, are you really hopeful of the global community taking any concrete steps?
It is quite an uphill battle, to be honest, but we are incredibly hopeful. And in some ways, I do believe that this pandemic has really awakened the world to the reality of how China functions. We've seen a very clear example globally now, how their policies of suppressing information and oppressing those who speak the truth have now affected the global community in this massive way. And so in that regard, the conversation has started to shift again to looking at how China operates and bringing the attention to them again. And as we see them continuing to act with honestly insane continuing aggression towards all the countries around them and just making enemy after enemy, we are hopeful that this is the time that the international community can at last wake up to the reality of who China is.
Right. Let's hope that that's what happens going forward. I mean, obviously, there is this pandemic that the world is dealing with, which, as Donald Trump has also called it, the Chinese virus, so to speak, because it originated from Wuhan. But having said that, let's hope that the Campaign for Uyghurs takes into account, is taken into account, is understood by the powers that be in the global community, and some action is taken forward going forward. Thank you so much, Julie Millsap, for joining us today.